and I want to welcome you all to this week's Policy and Advocacy training session. So thank you guys so much for being here. We really appreciate it, and we are very excited for this week's session, the second out of our 6 sessions. So I want to start by talking a little bit about what this session is really about, because I'm sure that the topic of, looking back and looking forward is a little bit confusing. I hope you've had time to take a look at the website, which might provide a bit more context, and I'm going to put it in the chat in case you haven't seen it. So this week's session is really about sort of how we get to this point and how we move forward. What are the things that could have been done differently in the past that would have put us in a better position today? And how can we change moving forward to make sure that we set ourselves up for success in the future? We also want to have some long-term discussions about sort of the trends in policy that we see and kind of how you create those trends, how you push things in the right direction, and how you change course moving forward. If we're able to look back and see what we could have done differently, how do we make sure that the next time we're in a position to make those choices, we recognize the different paths that the road can take? So I want to give a huge thank you to our 3 speakers for today. We've got Sally Braun, Rob McMahon, and Jeffrey Blackwell. And as with last time, I would really encourage all of you to put your questions in the chat or to go ahead and raise your hand. These discussions, or this session, is going to be a discussion. You are really encouraged to participate, to share insight into your own background, into your own experience, give some context to the things that the speakers are saying, and to also ask all of your questions, because there is no such thing as a silly question in this group. I also want to say thank you to the individuals who reached out with suggestions after the last session. If you have suggestions on how to make these run more smoothly in the future, please let me know. That's really helpful. And one of the key pieces that we heard, and I will re-emphasize for our great speakers today, is that acronyms can be really difficult, especially when you are new to this space. So we're going to sort of play a little bit of acronym bingo. Anytime you hear an acronym for a speaker, from one of the speakers that you don't understand, I want you to ping it in the chat, and this will help all of us not only recognize when we use those, but also then we can explain them in the chat, and I'll be running, back end on that to make sure that we explain everything. But please don't be afraid to say, I have really no idea what you're talking about, because it's really helpful, and we're happy to explain. So with that, again, huge thank you to our speakers, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, Jeff, would you like to introduce yourself and make a brief opening statement?
Sure. Hej, Chukma. So Jeffrey Blackwell. My name is Jeff Blackwell. I work as the Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel for Ameren Risk Management. Ameren is not a very well-known name nationwide, but it is a household name in Indian country here in the United States. We are Indian country's insurance provider and risk management provider. About 4 years ago, I joined Ameren about 5 years ago. I worked at the Federal Communications Commission before that. I worked at the FCC twice before. But 4 years ago, our board here at Ameren asked us to give back, start a business that would give back to the tribes. We insure infrastructure all over Indian country, and they wanted us to start a business to help tribes build infrastructure. So we took a look at transportation, energy, and telecom, and ended up in telecom with Ameren Critical Infrastructure. I first met ISOC a few years ago at an ICANN meeting in Abu Dhabi, of all places, and I'm really very profoundly impressed by what ISOC does to bring Indigenous communities together and to talk about Indigenous connectivity. And Ameren and Ameren Critical Infrastructure have been a supporter for a long time. We're also going to be starting a North American Indigenous chapter. If you attended last year's ICS, you probably heard about that. We've been delayed by COVID a little bit, but are ready to move forward. And hopefully we'll have some announcements to make by the time of the actual meeting. But it's a real honor to be here, and especially with Rob and Sally. These are 2 individuals that have taught me a great deal about the similarities between what we're experiencing in the United States and in Canada. I look forward to being involved with them. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. Rob, do you want to go ahead? Introduce yourself in a brief statement.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Rob McMahon. I'm joining you all from Edmonton in Canada. I'm just going to start with a bit of a disclaimer. I had a bit of a medical situation, nothing serious over the weekend, but I had my appendix taken out. So I'm not as robust as I usually am on these kind of things. So please bear with me. I'm going to participate by reading some comments. So yeah, I just wanted to say that up front because I'm not my usual self, but I'm so happy to be here and to be part of this panel. It's been fantastic having a chance to contribute to and participate in Indigenous Connectivity Summit events, and especially with this panel with Sally and Jeff. Awesome conversations. I was leaving all of our planning discussions just fired up. It's been amazing. And I work as an associate professor at the University of Alberta. So I'm in the Department of Political Science and in Media and Technology Studies. And then I'm also the coordinator up here in Canada of a group called the First Mile Connectivity Consortium, which is involved in some policy work, actually representing different First Nations technology providers, service providers across Canada. And I wanted to end by just saying that I'm a non-Indigenous person. I've been involved with lots of friends and colleagues in this work over the years, and just, yeah, really learning so much every day. So thank you for the opportunity and the privilege to contribute.
Okay, thank you, Rob. My name is Sally Braun, and I'm the General Manager of the Western James Bay Telecom Network. We're an ISP located in Mushkegowuk Tribal Council territory on the west side of James Bay in Canada. My background is in library and information technology and international development. I've done tours of duty in Papua New Guinea, St. Lucia, and most recently, I spent the last 13 years on the James Bay coast. I'd like to thank Mushkegowuk Tribal Council for giving Western James Bay the opportunity to exist. And I'm also a director, I think I'm a director of the First Mile Connectivity Consortium along with Rob. So I've been the general manager at Western James Bay for about 8 years. We're in the process of rolling out a fiber to the home project for over 1,000 homes in Attawapiskat, Sheshawin, and Fort Albany. This has of course been delayed by COVID, but we're hoping to have everybody connected by December of 2021. I'd like to thank Rob and Jeff for being on this panel with me. This is a very interesting topic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lead off with a statement to kind of frame the discussion. And then we're going to look at 5 individual pieces of policy that we think are worthy of reconsideration. So I'll just start the opening statement. And we kind of framed our discussion around what is the purpose of the internet. We kind of had that in the back of our minds all through our conversations on this. So I'll start off with this. A sesh is a rare phenomenon which occurs in a freshwater body of water when the water moves back in a standing wave to expose the floor of the lake bed for an extended period. I can remember this happening in Penetanguishene, Ontario one year. The east end of the harbor became a mudflat, exposing decades of garbage, rusty tins, and old boats littering the bottom of the harbor. In many ways, COVID-19 is like that sesh, in the sense that it has exposed all our crevices of societal neglect and inequity to the full light of day for the last 6 months. Those of us providing internet to First Nations people are now tasked with an even more enormous responsibility to our clients because of how this disease spread. This is an added responsibility that has been thrust upon us with a rapidity and an urgency that we did not see coming, and some of us are poorly equipped to respond to. In the last few months, the team at Western James Bay Telecom Network has fielded calls for help from First Nations councils in Ontario and British Columbia. Educators in remote First Nations communities are turning to us for help. Our leadership is unable to communicate with each other due to outdated residential legacy equipment in their home. Medical staff are unable to FaceTime their families for weeks due to poor connectivity. These are just a few examples of who is asking us for help. All these things that are happening have made me ask the question, what is the purpose of the internet? Is it a utility? Is it a military asset? Is it an investment instrument? Or is it a conduit for social good? We would like to use this training session to lay out a framework for a discussion which will look at 5 areas of policy which we believe require a reset, a very thoughtful second look. If the internet is to be an instrument to effect the betterment of our social capital. These policies areas are competition, measurement, mechanisms, technology, and energy. In this panel, we would discuss how competition runs counter to human nature, and therefore competition is not working in humanity's best interest when it comes to equal, equitable access to the internet. We will discuss how it is human nature for those in competition with each other to stay with others of like minds, and how this mindset works to the detriment of our economic potential and sovereign rights as First Nations people. We will discuss how access to and the quality of internet service is measured using outdated tools which work to the disadvantage of first-mile end-user clients. We will discuss the flaws in the mechanisms by which the internet is deployed. These mechanisms would include policy/regulatory solutions and fund development. We will look at the technology used by large carriers which base deployment of middle-mile networks on geography, population, density, and spectrum parameters, rather than base their deployment on a per-person model, and how first-mile users cannot afford to pay the open access fee requirements. And lastly, we will look at energy and discuss, is the internet young enough that we have a window of opportunity here to create networks that are sustainable with respect to the energy they require? And can green energy be part of the equation? I believe this is something we should all be considering, given the internet is on track to use 20% of our global electricity output by 2035. So, can we build future networks that run on green energy and basically kill 2 birds with 1 stone? So that's the framework of what we are going to be discussing in this session. And Rob, did you want to lead off in your general comments area and go into discussing competition?
Sure. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to discuss about the competition piece. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Sally. I also wanted to begin just by noting, like here in Canada, I'm not sure the balance of participants, like who's from the US, who's from Canada, and who might be joining us internationally. But I'll speak a bit about telecommunications policy and regulation in Canada, just to set the stage. So in Canada, we have 2 primary public institutions that manage telecom policy and regulation. We've got the first acronym, CRTC, or the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. It's a quasi-judicial arm's length regulator and it sets standards for services, regulates entities that build and provide services, and also quite recently began providing funding through the redistribution of revenues from service providers through a broadband fund. And then the other major entity is Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, or ICED, which is a federal department that has a minister, and it manages spectrum and satellite licenses and provides funding through a number of programs through tax revenues. So we have these kind of two main policy entities. There are others, but those are kind of the two major ones. So I'm going to speak a bit to competition. So with respect to competition, which includes who deploys services, Indigenous communities, citizens, and the organizations they have created need not be restricted to consumers of telecommunication services. They can also act as producers, owners, and operators of infrastructure and services. The principles of competition operate differently in small population and geographically dispersed, such as rural and remote Indigenous communities. For-profit companies that are required to maximize profit for their shareholders are placed in a difficult position in such contexts, which fail to generate adequate return on investment without subsidy. So rather than subsidize these types of organizations, government and the private sector can and should support the efforts of nonprofit service providers that are located in the affected regions, many of which are set up, owned, and operated by Indigenous communities. Unlike large commercial telecom service providers, nonprofit organizations exist to serve the needs of their communities. After initial capital investment and ongoing operational supports, which are the same supports that private sector organizations ask to receive in these same contexts, nonprofit organizations can reinvest any surplus revenue back into the enterprise or the community. These surplus revenues might be used for activities such as deploying or updating infrastructure, improving quality of service, lowering prices for users, or applying excess revenues for other social, economic, or cultural projects depended on by the community, as well as other activities. Local nonprofit organizations also circulate revenues inside geographically rural or remote communities, thereby contributing to the development of a sustainable economic base. Competition also runs counter to Indigenous sovereignty over community economic development and ownership and control over infrastructure and services. Digital infrastructure and services are essential for the social, cultural, and economic development of all nations, including Indigenous nations. These fundamental nation-building activities should not be affected or influenced by the desires of shareholders located in faraway urban centers to turn a profit on their investments. Furthermore, principles of competition threaten to undermine cooperation in low-resourced environments. Rather than cooperating to support community initiatives, competition encourages individuals and organizations to spend time and resources attempting to secure limited resources such as funding or customers in a zero-sum game, whereby one gets one so another doesn't get that. The whole community approach to broadband development, developed by Brian Beaton and Susan O'Donnell, provides a holistic broadband planning framework that considers first, residents and households, second, community institutions or anchor tenants, which include health centers, schools, businesses, and so on, and third, regional telecommunications transport infrastructure that connects multiple communities, or sometimes called the middle mile or the backhaul. These three elements are further situated in overall surrounding lands, waters, and space, which is a perspective that reflects environmental considerations that influence choices over different paths of technology development. I'll just conclude by saying that that document is available in the resources on the ISOC website. And just with respect to COVID-19, as Sally put it so eloquently, the pandemic is further exposing long-standing disparities in many areas, including socioeconomic, regional, and service inequalities. It provides overwhelming evidence of the need for broadband as an essential service, but we must think carefully about who, what, when, how, and why broadband gets deployed at this time of crisis. The networks that are set up now will be in place for years and maybe decades to come. And therefore, we need to ask critical questions about the decisions that are made regarding broadband development in our regions and communities. And I'll just end by saying, although I'm stating these comments, these have been developed in collaboration with all the members of the First Mile Connectivity Consortium. Okay, thank you, everyone. That's my statement for that.
Jeff, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, so we're gonna, folks, we developed this this curriculum, this panel in coordination, and identified the subjects that Sally highlighted at the outset as being core and central to the ideology of community deployment in indigenous communities. Community-based broadband deployment in tribal communities in the United States is what we call it. So I think it's very important for anybody who's getting training. We all thought that it was very important to have an understanding of the field and where community networks find themselves in the field and where they find themselves vis-a-vis certain important concepts in laws and policies. So I think the first and most important thing I should say is that robust broadband is essential to sovereignty. It is essential to sovereignty and self-determination. I, along with Matt Rantanen, who's here, I co-chair the Tech and Telecom Subcommittee of the National Congress of American Indians, the largest and oldest intertribal government body. I also have the honor of chairing the parent committee to that, the Economic Finance and Community Development Committee. And whereas 20 years ago, that parent committee looked at broadband issues as a vast subset of all of the things that the National Congress of American Indians does on advocating on behalf of tribal nations, now NCAI sees sees broadband as a theme running through everything, that it touches everything. And now our awareness of the lack of robust broadband is at an all-time high with COVID-19. I will tell you, as an attorney, as a tribal attorney, and having worked in economic development, and as a former federal regulator and a senior manager attorney with the Federal Communications Commission, I have come to believe that competition only brings a certain level of broadband to Indian country, to tribal nations. It does not bring the most robust broadband. So in the late 80s and early 90s, the regulatory ideology of competition came to the forefront when it came to utilities, and really most fervently in the telecom world. In the United States, the 1996 Telecom Act, it was one of the major themes. Competition was going to drive prices down, it was going to drive innovation, it was going to spread technologies across this large continent, but it has not, and for a couple of key reasons. It sounds like somebody needs to be on mute, unless you have a question. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat. But what I was going to say is that when it comes to rural lands and tribal lands, competition really, we don't have the kind of predicate requirements. We don't have high population density. We don't have relative affluence and wealth. We also have extreme distance and terrain challenges. So there are times when competition gets a certain level of connectivity to Indian country at a certain price. But I can tell you, for 20 years, the Federal Communications Commission in Washington has been trying to incentivize competitive carriers to come into the marketplace. In 2000, the FCC promulgated two major area of regulations. One was a certain type of status for new carriers to get access to federal subsidies, and another was a credit literally paying the wireless carriers to build out with a credit in future spectrum auctions, electromagnetic spectrum frequencies. For commercial purposes, these are auctioned in the United States, and they've become vastly expensive. Yet from that day to this, in many different efforts in between, we still lack robust broadband in a majority of Indian country. And it's largely because at the end of the day, there are certain carriers in a competitive environment we cannot incentivize enough to build out. It just simply is not their business model. So in the alternative, looking at a community-based model, for many reasons, both intentional and maybe unintentional, also become very important models for tribal nations, for First Nations. I suppose the last thing I'll say about competition is that right now, for the last 10 years with the federal community, and I was, my office worked on some of the initial reverse auctions that the FCC held. And I did not know, but I learned from Sally and Rob that Canada is trying this method as well. Essentially, a reverse auction is finding a body of subsidy money and then putting it on auction for competitive bidding for the build out. And it's really not supposed to be a low cost, sort of lowest bid government contract type of thing. It's supposed to be the most efficient use of and effective use of the subsidy. However, from the Mobility Fund and the Tribal Mobility Fund of 2012 into 2013, and now looking down the barrel of the Rural Development Opportunities Fund, the RDOF, I'm worried. We have not seen robust broadband come to tribal lands, to tribal-centric business models. The subsidization has been extreme for competitive entry. And with the RDOF, we are now, there are limited places in Indian country in the United States that look like they're going to benefit from it. And those would be predicated on a regulated, competitive, private provider in the area. But I do encourage folks, we did struggle a little bit trying to find some resource material for this, this concept of how competition operates not well in Indian country. But I do hope that you'll get a chance to read some of the materials up there. There is a touch on it in the Tribal Technology Assessment Tool from the Arizona State University American Indian Policy Institute, and would be happy to follow up on any questions. Sally, back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. And yes, Jeff has put some excellent resources there. There's also a piece that I wrote on the concept of competition. It's entitled The Adversarial Divide. And the adversarial divide that I refer to arises from the regulations that govern two very different business models. There are the regulations adhered to by the for-profit corporations and those adhered to by the not-for-profit corporations. And for decades, the not-for-profit telecom companies have not invested in remote communities because the return on investment is not fast enough to warrant it. So in many ways, I believe that we're working to our detriment in Canada if we do not bring our Indigenous peoples on board as full partners in shaping what our post-pandemic society is going to look like. And they cannot do that really if they do not have connectivity. So I won't go into the entire piece that I wrote on the adversarial divide, but I have put it up as a resource. Quite simply, the concept of competition, and I echo what Jeff is saying, it is not working for our Indigenous populations. and it's to the detriment of our sovereignty, and it's to the detriment of our economic prosperity, and it's lowering our gross domestic product. So for the next area, I'll move on to the concept, the area of policy that we think needs to be reconsidered, and that is measurement. And I'll ask Rob if you want to speak to that piece.
Okay, thanks, Sally. So here's some comments about measurement, reflecting on the situation here in Canada. So mapping initiatives are important for guiding the development of funding programs and spectrum deployment plans, and for measuring their impact, so sort of the development as well as the evaluation side. In 2018, the Office of the Auditor General of Canada pointed out some of the limitations in existing measurement and policy approaches to connectivity in rural remote regions. So I included a link to the Auditor General's report as one of the resources if anybody's interested in looking at more detail. In Canada, criticisms have been raised regarding the mapping methodologies used. For example, if a single point is connected in a 25-kilometer hexagon, if there's one point connected, that entire area is considered served. Criticisms are also raised in the maps used to determine spectrum licenses, similar to the problem above, right? So many spectrum license areas are really large geographic regions, and they might include one or two urban centers and then many smaller towns or villages. So you might have an urban center and then a huge space, but if you want to purchase the spectrum license, you'd have to purchase that whole area. And if the urban centers are served, sometimes the deployment requirements are considered to be met, leaving many smaller geographically rural remote areas without service. I also wanted to point out there's also limited data available regarding infrastructure, quality of service or user experience, and affordability in many rural remote communities. We don't even have the information available really. And there's limited information available regarding the availability of dark fiber and or conduit. So there may be infrastructure in place that could be accessible, but people aren't aware whether or not it's there or not. So one proposal that's actually in place in other countries, I'm not sure if it's, I think as well in the US, I'm not sure, Jeff could say, but there's been proposals for a public database that might illustrate where and how service providers could access already existing resources like conduit or fiber. We do have a case of some mobile carriers warehousing spectrum, so they might own a license without deploying it. And there's a limited market for the secondary use of spectrum. It's kind of a technical term, but like subordinate spectrum licenses, where you might purchase a license, lease it. If it's used, if it's owned by somebody else, you can purchase uses of that so you can deploy it. In Canada, those two acronyms I mentioned, ICED and the CRTC, recognize these data limitations, and they do provide mechanisms for community members to look at existing service maps and then give them some feedback over whether or not they're accurate. So that's kind of a call to action for everybody on this call. If you're based in Canada and you're living in a community, you could visit the availability map on ICED's website and then just determine whether or not it reflects the kind of service that you can access in your own community. And I think just to end, this is also a digital literacy issue, is if users become more aware of these different mechanisms where they can report their quality of service, whether or not they get access, what the affordability rates are, this could be something that might be built into digital literacy programs as a school assignment, or in, you know, kind of like a library or other type of learning center. So thanks, I'll stop there, Sally.
Jeff, did you want to speak briefly on this?
Sure.
We're at the 40-minute mark here.
Sure. I mentioned earlier the rural digital opportunity fund. Excuse me. rural development is a part of our Department of Agriculture. One of the reasons why we're very concerned about the RDOF moving forward is that the state of the National Broadband Map in the United States as it relates to Indian country is poor. It is it is not an effective map for all the same reasons that Rob just mentioned. It is not an issues map. It is not usable in the way that it should be for the purposes of deployment or understanding the use of the internet in relation to deployment. Unfortunately, it has its roots in our 10 years ago in our Stimulus Act, and it is carrier reported data that only recently has received an amount of double checking. Like the map in Canada, it reflects deployment as being a service offering in a location in a particular area, census designated area, not actual deployment. It also doesn't relate, importantly, to cost, to affordability. So it's not just that it's not just that it's faulty, that it's flawed, but it's the way in which it's flawed. It's the way in which the data is recovered. And it is a real shame that we have federal programs with billions of dollars in them moving forward to solve, to provide solutions in Indian country in the US that unfortunately turn out to be sort of a fire ready aim type of situation. So I do encourage everyone here from the United States and also from Canada to look at your respective national maps. And I'm very fortunate. There are 310 reservations in the United States. I've been on about 250 of them over the course of my life. Majority of those have been since I was an adult. I've been to about 40 of the Alaska Native villages, and I encourage you to take a look at the map and how it would measure your own tribal lands or reserve, and see if it's correct in a real world situation. This has to be, this will be something that is going to be a solve for problem in the United States. So thank you. Thanks, Sally.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. That's wonderful. I guess what's really important is that to close off this section is for us to present ourselves as professionally as possible, as the people that can make policy. So if we can educate ourselves, we're working with communities, if we can educate ourselves and not leave the policy making to others, just to step up and present ourselves as professionally as we can, and make these points that we're making now, say this is not working and here's a solution. So if we can, you don't get anywhere by criticizing people that are making policy, but if you can offer solutions, that is really important. And I think that Rob and Jeff are outlining some ways that the measurement piece can be improved. We'll move on to mechanisms and fund deployment. I see we do have some questions, and I'm hoping that we can get through all this in time to answer some. Mechanisms and fund deployment. Jeff or Rob, are you okay to read through this piece and maybe Tracy in a bit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I can hit some of the highlights of this because I know we want to make sure we have time for questions. I did want to note that this section will address one of the questions, which was that a lot of the programs seem directed to large telcos. And so funding for broadband deployment and operations in rural remote areas actually should be treated separately than funding in urban centers because the challenges are very different. So funding for remote and rural areas should be dispersed in a manner responsive to proposals with a specific focus on proposals generated by or in close consultation with communities and nonprofit providers that are based and operating in the regions. Jeff talked a bit about that reverse auction model, and this is an alternative approach around proposal-based funding models that allow a more customized approach to funding that better reflects the needs and context of affected communities and regions. So they can ensure things like ensuring equitable deployment of infrastructure to all members of a community rather than maybe cherry picking some of the easiest to serve customers. Requesting applicants provide demonstrated evidence of community consultation and tangible benefits like training and employment for community members or local residents. Ways to integrate planning with local anchor tenants like schools, health centers, businesses in a way that provides economies of scale. Recognition of cultural, language, and environmental requirements identified by communities and supporting affordability goals. I'm just going to skip some stuff. But one thing I would say just to end is that COVID-19 conditions might justify an emergency fund that's specifically for nonprofit and Indigenous providers such as Sally's group and many others that Jeff and others work with. We recognize that this is a crisis, so why should these providers who are already operating in these regions have to compete with others in order to gain access to these funds in order to continue doing the services that they do to provide essential services through telecom infrastructure? Why can't we treat these as the diverse and different organizations that they are and then support them with a separate fund in that way? So I'll just stop there. Thanks, Sally.
Okay, and I'd just like to quickly add that I'd like to see another aspect of how funding is given out, and that is the whole idea of the merit of an unsolicited proposal. Because right now it seems we have to wait for a funding opportunity to be announced, and we scramble to comply with the deadline. And could we not look at opening a funding platform for merit-based proposals? And I have some other stuff here about how the barriers that we certainly faced to try, and it took us 4 years to pull together the funding for the fiber to the home proposals. And I'm happy to speak to anyone about those obstacles. I actually have a short piece on it I can share. We ran into problems with the banks. They didn't quite know what to do with us as an Indigenous organization that seemed to have its ducks in a row, and we didn't seem to fit into any particular category. We couldn't get funding from the Business Development Bank of Canada because we were not a for-profit. And we just ran into all sorts of obstacles. With being evaluated 4 and 5 times by evaluators that we continually had to educate about what it was that they were looking at. So those are my comments. Jeff, do you have anything to add to this piece about?
Yeah, I do. This is an area where I think the resources that Katie has linked and that are available on the ISOC website can really help bring the participant, the trainee, up to speed on how subsidy mechanisms in the United States work and what's missing when it comes to tribal communities. So the largest, so our Federal Communications Commission is an independent regulatory commission. It does have quasi-judicial powers like the CRTC does in Canada, but it is largely essentially an economic regulator. It doesn't do grants and loans like the executive branch, but it has over $11.5 billion a year in subsidies. And they're largely for 4 purposes. The first and largest part is corporate subsidy. It's called the High Cost or Connect America Fund, and it has gone to subsidized corporate, operational, and capital expenditures. So not just capital, not just the technology, but also the operations. The other three programs are related to major legislated missions of subsidy in the federal government: education, healthcare, in low-income communities. So the famous E-rate program, the low-income Lifeline and Link Up program, and then the rural healthcare program. These were legislated in the '96 Telecom Act. They have been modernized by the Federal Communications Commission to support not just historical plain old telephone service, but also broadband now. However, they become sort of dull tools when they've been tweaked and upgraded and tweaked and upgraded, and various subsidiary incentives or programs within them, like the Tribal Lifeline program to try to increase affordability for tribal families, low-income families. What has really come around, I really like this idea that we discussed at length about a proposal-based methodology. And it seems to fit the long-standing priority of tribal nations in the United States to create a federal tribal broadband fund. From the tribal perspective, a project has to include many different missions. From the federal perspective, it's just that agency's mission and not related to the other purposes. We're going to talk about one of them later, energy. But if you're looking at a community-based model and trying to build something that is robust, sustainable, affordable, and in a real priority for all the community needs, it's a very difficult thing to run the gauntlet of having to try to engender competitors or build a competitive entry. So I would like for folks, I want to ask folks to take a look at a recent piece of legislation that was submitted actually by my own member of Congress, Deb Haaland, one of the first two two women who are member of tribes elected to Congress, to the United States Congress, and Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, the Digital Reservations Act. And it really does two things. It the first thing it does is it actually creates spectrum set-asides and opportunities and returns spectrum, commercial spectrum to tribal lands. I mean, to tribal nations, over tribal lands to tribal nations. So it sort of permanently eliminates the public availability of tribal spectrum. The second thing that it does is it creates the first ever tribal broadband fund at the Federal Communications Commission, which has broad-based purposes to address all sorts of needs in Indian country. And I'll say one of the, we're going to probably talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the technology, but one of the major pieces that's missing in the United States to get robust services to tribal lands, and by robust, I saw there was a question, by robust, I don't mean just the statutory definition of tribal lands. I mean a level of connectivity that you can run a country on, something that can support economic development, education, healthcare, significant, and that can support both wireline and wireless services. But this fund, one of the major pieces that's missing is 8,000 miles of middle mile fiber in Indian country. We miss but for 8,000 missing miles of fiber, we would have such better opportunity with those that do come down the road, like this 2.5 gigahertz opportunity that just closed at the FCC. So I would encourage folks to take a look at the Digital Reservations Act for its implications for a new type of funding mechanism that would cover that middle mile fiber, that would cover potentially gap financing, that would cover technical assistance, that would cover myriad needs, and direct it, not just nationally, but to these, extreme areas that are disconnected. Thanks, Sally.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. The next section is on technology. Rob, can you very briefly just talk a little bit about this? Or, yeah.
Yep, no problem. And I think Jeff raised a really good point there about sort of the middle mile, the missing transport in a lot of regions. So of course, communities need to be connected to the rest of the internet. Of course, you need to connect households and other organizations inside communities, but a lot of the time it's that transport or backhaul link that's missing. In places where it is in place, it needs to be really made open access. And in Canada, there's been a lot of debate over what's actually meant by open access. And that ties into questions of what are the conditions of gaining access to that regional network, what are the costs to do so, and what are the requirements, even technical requirements in order to make that interconnection happen. I would also say, and Sally will probably speak to more of this, is the need for more internet exchange points, or IXPs. There's another acronym for everyone. Especially located in some of the more rural areas and remote and northern areas. Somebody in the chat talked about 2.5 gigahertz, those tribal spectrum, and that sounds like a fantastic opportunity in the States that Jeff mentioned. As of now, I'm not aware of anything like that in Canada with respect to spectrum for Indigenous communities or territories specifically. So we're really excited to see that happening in the States. And the last thing I'll say about backhaul is about satellite. There was a case in the past where in order to get the orbital position license for satellites, of course, like that position on, when I go like this, I'm talking about this is the path of the satellite going around the Earth. In order to secure a license for that path, groups had to apply to a regulator at the national level. So in Canada, that would be ICS. And that the applicants had to demonstrate that they were providing some public benefit in exchange for that. And in the past, that public benefit actually included free access to satellite space that was taken up and used by KNET services in Northwest Ontario and others. So we also have to look to the space for some of these resources and policy. I mean, space policy, especially with talk of low Earth orbital satellites and elsewhere, does have a place in solving the digital divide, and also maybe an opportunity to make sure we secure a public benefit for those public resources. Thanks, Sally.
So Sally, I can pick up quickly. I think one of the first and most important things that an Indigenous community, a tribal nation, must do is a holistic needs assessment and plan, develop a plan. And sit back and this stuff is expensive, okay? This is not your typical carpentry where you measure twice and cut once. Measure 3, 4, 5 times. Get to know the technologies, get to know the qualities of the technologies. I agree with Rob. Virtually every technology out there is going to have to play a role in getting connectivity to the remaining billion people on the planet that are not on the internet or have the internet in very limited ways. I'm going to make an argument here for prioritizing the spend, prioritizing this money, prioritizing whatever in a tribal budget or a community budget or in an institution's budget for the highest quality, long-lasting technology. Right now for backhaul, it's fiber. And fiber, it's expensive. It is definitely one of those measure 5 times, cut once types of technology. I'm very excited about the potential of low Earth orbit satellites, but I worry that there are still going to be choke points. They're going to have to be a gap measure until we can get this big continent wired. But it is a terrible thing to have to, for a community to have to look at the potential of spending of point-to-point microwave for backhaul versus fiber. It's the longer way around the barn. It is, more expensive, to be sure. If planned well, it doesn't have to be outrageously expensive, but it has lasting capability. Fiber is the Valhalla of service right now. I met a company a long time ago in Israel that was talking about, an Israeli company that was talking about the next generation of wireless compression technology being the next big breakthrough. I look forward to that happening. It hasn't happened yet, but right now, there's a unique relationship also between fiber, power, towers, and spectrum. And Rob, the 2.5 gigahertz in the United States it's not the greatest spectrum. It is not available to all tribes in the United States, but it is fairly robust, and we'll see at what power levels it can be built out in various places. But it is a very important, conceptually, it's a very important element of getting involved in the community. I would say approach these technologies as an owner and an operator, not just a consumer. So the 2.5 gigahertz opportunity is putting hundreds of tribes into that position of being a licensee. Hopefully the Digital Reservations Act will put them in an even more advantageous position, with spectrum that isn't currently being used being returned to them. But when it comes to the technology, this brings around one of the first issues that we talked about as a panel. Does competition work? The reason why I said earlier that competition only puts a particular level of broadband into Indian country is because often it's a low cost kind of spend and a high cost kind of cost, or what the family or the community experiences. So there are large parts of Indian country that, still have old cable or even paired copper wiring with some sort of digital subscriber line, something on it. But I am very excited at the potential of community networks aggregating the demand of their communities, looking at all of the various components that have needs, all of the core community institutions that have needs, and then getting together their spend to be able to prioritize top quality communications equipment. So you will learn more about this in the course of ICS. This is the kind of stuff that ISOC specializes in. I just put my contact information in the chat. Feel free to reach out. I meant to do that earlier, but when it comes to the quality, it gets easier to pay for over time. And although fiber can be high maintenance, it is also has virtually limitless future proofing. So thanks, Sally.
Thanks, Jeff. I just wanted to add something. We've talked about how the competition, the way competition is set up now, where it's basically set up to fail. When Canada was first started to grow, and children and families moved out across this magnificent land that we have, schools were started. Education was brought to the student. Education was brought to the community. And this concept of bringing a service to the community has been lost by the way competition is set up. And this is where I say we're doing a disservice to our country by having the internet deployed the way we do. The internet should be brought to every home, just like a driveway is put it to every home, just like hydro is brought to every home. We need to get away from the idea that the internet is something that is only deployed to communities that can afford it. It should be an essential service to everyone and should be brought to every home. And this is where policy needs to change. The next section has to do with energy, and this is a subject that I've been doing a lot of thinking about, and I've been trying to, if anyone out there knows anyone that is doing research in this area, I would really like to talk to them. I was very pleased to see the Internet Society has put out a $200,000 US grant. It's all up on their website. It was just put up a couple of days ago into research into this area. And I think this is going to be very, very critical. So what I'm researching these days is the possibility of a stronger relationship between Indigenous connectivity and the energy sector. This research started with a conversation I had in Hawaii with Dr. Hossein Boudrin, who's on this call actually. I followed up with Hossein after the summit, and together we brought together a group of people in Timmins to explore the idea of having an IXP located in Timmins, partly to conserve the cost of energy for the backhaul. Right now, we're having to backhaul to an IXP in Toronto. And I had also read some articles which made me think more about the energy forecasts for internet into the next 2 decades. And according to the energy forecasts, 20.9% of the world's energy will be consumed by the internet by 2030. And I posted 2 links on the website, 2 articles that are pertain to this subject. So how can we keep our environmental impact in check as the industry that we're in? It seems to me that we have an opportunity here to develop a relationship with the green energy sector, which may want to be our partner in building Indigenous networks that run on green energy at the community level. And Brian Beaton, who's my mentor, I talked to him about this, and he said, so to answer your question, Sally, I believe the biggest challenge is getting the engineers and researchers involved in the energy sector to recognize and appreciate the unique relationship and opportunity they have with the communities they serve. But what I'm finding is most of these people work in their own silos without any desire to expand their scope of practice or to engage with people. They love their machines so much that they forget the people and the communities who make their work and livelihoods possible. So Brian, he's been trying to reach out to the energy sector for years, but he also believes that I'm onto something very important. And it's, for those of you who aren't familiar with Western James Bay, the only reason we exist is because there was a fiber line, there was a diamond mine built 90 miles west of Attawapiskat, and it needed power. So when the power line came up, the transmission line came up the coast from Moosonee to Attawapiskat, it needed to be monitored. So there were 24 strands of dark fiber. We were able to get at least to us 12 of those strands, and that's what we're running our network on. So wherever there is a deployment, a transmission line being built, and the communities along those lines, they need to talk to the people that are bringing those transmission lines into their community and saying, hey, you know, is there any way we can work together so we can get connectivity in our communities? So I think that's the other thing that I've been thinking about is these companies that are running their transmission lines over what Jeff refers to as Indian country. Do they have permission? What is the nature of the permissions that they have? Is there an agreement? When was the agreement written that permits this connectivity to be running over Indigenous lands and the people living beside these lines, transmission lines, don't have access to the connectivity? So those are the agreements that need to be opened up and looked at and to see if they can be reconsidered. So I think that's all we have to say. It looks like we've got some time for questions if anyone has any questions. I think
Sally, I don't know why my eye starts twitching every time you've mentioned rights of way, but it was involuntary, I assure you.
I talked about that in Hawaii. Marielle Triggs and I had quite a heated discussion about it. The whole idea of opening up these rights of ways, like by what right is the transmission line going through Indigenous land? And maybe it's time to open up those agreements and negotiate.
We, in the US, we've seen a major Western carrier went through a series of rights of way negotiations about 20 years ago, and then 20 years ago to about 17 years ago. And this time around, when long haul carriers are coming, the tribes are much better informed about what's coming and what's going across their land and the value and utility of it. There's another resource that folks might find relevant here. Senators Udall, U.S. Senators Udall, Cantwell, and Heinrich are two senators from New Mexico, and Senator Cantwell from Washington State introduced in the Senate the Bridging the Tribal Digital Divide Act of 2020. So along with the Digital Reservation Act, this is another bill that's recently been introduced to address some core issues, and one of them is establishing a tribal broadband right-of-way pilot program. And being a former Fed, anytime we hear about pilot programs, I get a little itchy because they can either go wonderfully or they kind of go in the waste paper bin. But this is a key. This is very important. This is a very important component to a piece of legislation that streamlines a number of areas around our federal government to try to prioritize executive branch spending and get single application status. But rights of way, even when they're obtained, even when you see technology, ostensibly they should have been obtained, it's very hard to find the paperwork at times. I've witnessed fiber that's been run down a road and laid in a ditch, not even in conduit, supposedly perhaps in fulfillment of a right-of-way agreement. That really, the fiber never went anywhere. It lay there fallow, and just kind of as a sad reminder to sort of an unfulfilled right-of-way requirement. But I'm with Sally. I think we've touched on a number of areas. Happy to try to answer questions if people have them. I know that there have been a few that have come in the chat.
Katie, are there any questions in the chat?
Yes, there are, and I put them in the document that I sent you all privately. So if you'd like me to read them out, just let me know.
So there is, the first one is thoughts about 2.5 gigahertz in the USA and fulfilling build-out requirements. There's a little bit of time for the planning here. The Federal Communications Commission just closed their window last week, an extension window of a month. And there are multiple different ways to fulfill the build-out requirements. I'm sure that the summit will be talking about those, but it really depends on, the build-out requirement really depends on the way that the spectrum is going to be utilized. It is a robust build-out period. I think it's you know, there's a 2-year 50% and a 5-year 80% build-out mark based on population density. I know that there are tribes that are looking to do much better than 80%. But it's probably a little too detailed to go into here and now, but whether or not it's going to be a backhaul use of the spectrum, or a point to multi-point, or a sort of a traditional mobile, a spread use of it to mobile devices. There are different ways of meeting the build-out requirement. Looks like the second one was at me, and I did answer it privately on the chat, but is there a formal definition for robust? I think I've said robust about 7 or 8 times during this panel. Yeah. No, there isn't a formal definition. I referred earlier to what we talk about at the National Congress of American Indians. It's not, a trickle. It's not trickle down technology. The city shouldn't get the 5G and then the rest of the nation be on, be 30 years behind. It's really robustness from the internet all the way to the home as well. And whether you refer to last mile or first mile, being that piece of the internet, the piece of broadband that goes actually to the home, I think it's important to note that a lot of our federal programs in the United States, and it sounds like in Canada as well, a lot of the federal programs are aimed at that last mile, or that first step outside the community or the home, the door. But if you take a look at the Arizona State study, you'll see that one of the major findings is that respondents to this study on tribal lands are using smartphones as a primary means of their accessing the internet. So that would make people think that we are adopting wireless technologies at a higher rate than the rest of the country. Well, we are, because we're being forced there. We don't have that middle mile fiber. So it illustrates the missing piece. Yes, American Indians, and I think in Canada as well, our tribal members are highly mobile. Here where I work on Santana, there are a number of people that commute 40, 50 miles, other sides of town or to their own pueblos. And tribal communities are highly mobile. So mobile services are very important, but also it's a bit of a challenge because we don't have good wireline service to our lands. But the term robust used colloquially in discussions like this, I use it to mean it's got to be enough to run an entire community on. It looks like there's a lot more that piled in. So back to you guys. I'll throw it to you guys.
Jeff, I just wanted to speak to the last. There was a question there about fiber build out. What do you do if there's? I believe it's what do you do if there's fiber in the community? I mean, how do you access it? And we had to field a question like this. We were advising a group of First Nations last week about this very thing. And if there is fiber in your community now, I'm more than happy to help you figure out how to access it. There's a series of steps that you have to go through. You have to find out, first of all, who has the authority over it, and then you have to get the backing of your community, and then you approach and keep talking and negotiating to try and get access. As far as getting access to fiber, it's a mechanic. It's just mechanics. There are people that know how to do that know how to go in and hive off a community portion of fiber and put it into a shelter so that you can distribute it in your community. It's not difficult. It's not difficult to do. So if anyone needs help that way, they're welcome to contact me. The other thing too is if you have internet in your community, I believe KNET just underwent a socioeconomic study, and we're thinking of doing that ourselves, of doing a socioeconomic study of what is happening in our communities now in terms of economic development while we're on wireless, and then doing another one 5 years down the road. Because you can use the data, like once fiber to the home is in place, you can use the data from studies like that to provision your network, replace old equipment. The other thing that we didn't touch on at all was the whole concept of funding for diversity and redundancy. But those, if you have a network, those are also financial considerations. But basically, the policies as they are right now are impacting our GDP in Canada in a negative way. And we need to talk to the CRTC and maybe do some studies or find some studies that will explain to them how our prosperity will be enhanced if everyone has equitable and equal access to the internet.
So I just saw something in the chat, and I wanted to clarify. The federal programs that we have in the United States right now, they're not necessarily rural programs, but they're predicated on subsidizing that last mile. And they're also predicated on the involvement of a fully regulated telco, what the Federal Communications Commission calls an eligible telecommunications carrier, an ETC. And there's a similar status in Canada, but we're talking about privately held corporations that are fully fledged communications providers. Not necessarily the kind of models that are community oriented or tribal centric that we're talking about here at ISOC and with ICS. So we need to build out this lattice network of middle mile and backhaul services so that we can empower more local provision of services, and whether they're municipalities or tribal nations. It's just simply pure physics. These are going to be the entities that are going to take it on because it's their situation, it's their business model. One cannot expect, based on the data of the last 20 years, that other carriers are going to come in when they don't live there, they don't reside there. They have for-profit modeling that is predicated on other types of dynamics. So it is a bit of a challenging situation, but hopefully these two pieces of legislation and something like them will pass, and we'll be able to have markets for more local provision of services.
So there's I just posted one up in the chat. I absolutely love this question because whoever wrote it, I think, is on the right track. It's what are the best ways for middle mile folks to work with local community providers, especially if that local community provider doesn't yet exist? What role should we play, especially when we know we ourselves are a not-for-profit? That the community ownership is the best way to go. How can we help support them while respecting their sovereignty? I hope whoever wrote this question gets in touch with me, because this is these are the kind of partners that First Nation communities need. Anybody who has read a funding application knows that the requirement in many cases is that there be expertise. Sometimes they request 3 years of expertise before they'll even look at your application. And many First Nations don't have this. But if they could partner with another not-for-profit, such as whoever this not-for-profit is, then this is exactly the kind of partnership that needs to happen. And thank you very much for that question. Katie, how are we doing there? We've got 7 minutes left.
Can I just add something to what Sally was saying? Is somebody else wrote about like structural separation of the service and the infrastructure, and something like, would a middle mile provider who wants to cooperate with a community or work together, are they willing to lease infrastructure that's owned by a community in order to deliver service if they're a network operator? Do you know what I mean? So separating out the ownership of the actual physical asset from how it gets managed. And that ties into some of that open access discussion, like what does that look like in policy and operations? So that was something that got asked at the CRTC actually, was like, would telecommunications providers, large carriers, be willing to partner with local providers in order to fulfill their service obligations by leasing their infrastructure?
Rob, we had a situation like that where we wanted to partner with the entity that owned the spectrum in our region, and they basically wanted a free co-location. They actually wanted us to invest about $250,000 for them to even come in. So it would be nice if that was the attitude that people are working with, but it's not always the case. But all we can do, I think, is just keep trying to think that the people on the other side of the table with us, try and get them on our side of the table, or try and get them to understand that they're doing a public service. They're contributing to our sovereignty. They're contributing to the better economic development of Canada if they agree to help us, if they agree to partner with us. So, okay, 4 minutes left, Katie. Do you have anything you want to say? Do you want to say a wrap-up piece and let us go home early?
Yes, I appreciate that. And I was just looking through the last questions. I know that we probably didn't get to everything that was in the chat. So one actually sort of housekeeping thing I wanted to talk about before dropping off. Last year, we created a listserv for each training so that participants could sort of communicate together, send links, ask questions, and things like that. The list was not super frequently used, and so we didn't create one this year, but I can recreate that list, or I can create a Slack channel if that's of interest to the participants as a way of keeping in touch in between these sessions. So if you don't mind putting in the chat real quick, or actually even better, hang on, I think I can create a very quick poll, which I should have done beforehand, to find out what is the best option.
Katie, I'm just seeing here from one of the participants, from Trevor. Apparently, he's quoting a study that was done that found that doubling broadband speeds for an economy can add 0.3% to GDP growth. That's a pretty interesting statistic.
That is very interesting. Thanks so much for posting that.
Yeah.
Okay, and I've just launched a poll. It should show up on everyone's screen to find out if you would like me to create a listserv or a Slack channel for this group, or neither. And neither is totally fine. I also, in our last couple of minutes, want to remind everybody that the resources page, or the training page, has all of your resources and the recordings from each of these sessions. So if for any reason you missed last week's session, that recording is now up on the website, and you can watch it and then email me to still get counted for participation. Okay, and it looks like we're still only about 50% of the group has voted in the poll. So if you have not yet voted in the poll, please do so real quick. So far, we have Slack in the lead.
Katie, can I answer a question while Slack is taking the lead?
Yeah.
So Bert Lum, a colleague and friend from Hawaii, asked a question about, do you think open access will ever become a federal policy? That is a very good question. And it might depend greatly on politics and political party. Open access networks, Bert did reference and put in the chat a podcast of the wonderful Chris Mitchell, whom if you've not met, you should. He's with Community Networks. So the theory, it's more than theory. What open access often can spur innovation for community networks, and particularly open access in a more regional level. And frankly, the United States and federal regulators have been hard on competitive entries and have been hard on muni networks as well. This is something for folks to educate themselves about and to understand when a panel like this is talking to folks about the things to understand from the 50,000 foot level, and what does community networking mean, and what does it mean vis-a-vis not just the internet, but also other types of providers. I don't have a, Bert, everybody, none of us have a view into the future of federal policy, but I am worried. We're seeing more consolidation. We're seeing more corporatization, and genuinely in an environment where, with all of the things that have been going on, especially the exercise of so many civil rights in light of history, broadband should be a civil right. It absolutely should be. We live in an information age, and not being able to participate in it or being resigned to a second-class service. And yes, Sally, from time to time I will get critical, but we also work on solutions, and those that are left, they're hard asks. They're hard asks of the federal government and of a commercial-based environment. I'm hoping that we'll have more examples to point the government to in terms of open access community network paradigms. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I really appreciate that and agree with you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. We have Slack in the lead, so I will set that up before next week. Thank you guys very much for your feedback on that. And a huge thank you to all of our speakers, to Sally, Rob, and Jeff. We really appreciate your help and your wisdom on this. And I appreciate in advance that the participants can get in touch with you guys after the session if they have any more questions. So if your question was not answered, or if you just want to connect with one of our speakers, again, please reach out to me and I'm happy to facilitate that. So thank you guys so much. Appreciate you being on the sessions, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you, everyone.